Good afternoon. Got a big name today in our study of all the men and women of the Bible. But I think we could take care of it in one lesson. But it is a very big player, a very, I don't know what word to use really, legendary almost, big star in the scriptures, especially in the minds of the Jews and in their Old Testament history. He goes by the name of Elijah. He was one of the prophets, just not a prophet that had his own book named Elijah, although I guess if it had been God's will, he very well could have happened. That could have been the case. His ministry was just maybe quite a bit different. And I sort of think of him more in the camp of Samuel, as far as the prophets go. You know, we have the major prophets and the minor prophets, but then there was also Samuel and Elijah and Elisha, and I think those three sort of resemble one another more so than the prophets that have written their ministries or whatever and prophecies written. But Elijah was considered to be the most powerful. The Jews, at least, viewed him as the most powerful of the prophets. His name means God is Jehovah, or I guess you could say Jehovah is God. I don't know if that flip-flops correctly in Hebrew, but as we've talked about names a lot, you know, it ends with Yah or Jah, and it starts with El. So you've got God and Jehovah or Yahweh, they're both in there. So God is Jehovah is one of the possible meanings of his name. Pretty straightforward, it seems. He was a Tishbite. You know anybody else that was a Tishbite? I don't. Inform me if I overlook somebody. But a lot of times, "ite" at the end of a name refers to a person, and like Israelite is a descendant of Israel, Jacob. But in this case, it's not a person, it's a place. So I say that to say that this is literally the only thing we know about Elijah as far as background. Nothing. Except that he was from Tishbe, I guess, for lack of a better way to pronounce it, that was in Gilead. That's all we know. Not a single word of parentage, what tribe, I mean, nothing. He just bursts onto the scene in 1 Kings 17. We'd never even heard of Elijah before. If you're reading through 1 Kings, you're reading about some of the kings in the division period of once the kingdom was divided, and you know, one king rises after another, and one king in Judah, and then here's the king in Israel. If you look at the subheadings in chapter 16, it's Baasha reigns in Israel, Elah reigns in Israel, Zimri reigns in Israel, Omri reigns in Israel, Ahab reigns in Israel, and then all of a sudden, chapter 17 says, "Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab." Well, who's he? Where'd he come from? We're not told. He just it's kind of interesting. He also bursts off of the scene in the end, and although it wasn't as grand display as far as the reader is concerned, he just bursts onto the scene too, right there, out of nowhere. No explanation whatsoever, and yet he was one of the foremost and great prophets. Whenever you're in company with Jesus and Moses, that's a big deal. Referring to the Mount of Transfiguration, obviously. Moses and Elijah, those were the two. Why Elijah? Why not? Samuel was before Elijah, right? And why not Elisha? He came after and did a lot of great things. Why not Isaiah? You know, he's got however many chapters in his book and all this stuff. But it's Elijah, Moses and Elijah, because Moses was more or less considered the first prophet. Elijah was considered the strongest, for lack of a better word. Mighty, powerful. So, there's a lot of things that we could look at with his life, his ministry rather. But we'll try to sum it up instead. As the handout says, he was a fearless, bold, and dauntless reformer in chapter 18. There are a few events that we have to kind of probably take a look at because they're just too monumental to overlook. He was a rebuker of kings. Not a fun job for anybody to have. A mighty intercessor, should say mighty, it says might. Praying with faith and intensity. He was a man prone to discouragement, even a prophet like Elijah. Jeremiah wasn't the only one. Yep.
You know what's kind of interesting? The New Testament refers to Christ as the Elijah, whatever. And just like Melchizedek, and basically, I know Donovan referenced it one Wednesday night, it doesn't matter who your parents are or your history as a child. And when the Lord said you've got to take up your cross and follow me, these men followed God with whatever he said as adults. They were the ones who, that's what Christians are. You're not born a Christian in human sense. You become a Christian because you decide to follow God, regardless of how you were raised, regardless of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
You now have a future ahead of you. I just find it interesting that the important people didn't have, they just started off running.
Yeah. Yep.
The way we do.
Mm-hmm. So if you're in 1 Kings 17 and you read now Elijah the Tishbite, you're not going to assume that's the first time that he shows up in the Old Testament, but it is. You would assume probably that you've missed something, and he's got to be back there somewhere. But no, 1 Kings 17:1 is the first appearance of Elijah in the Old Testament narrative. We'll look a little bit at his discouragement that he dealt with. He was a person that was capable of fallible judgment. He was still human, even though he was a prophet of God. He was a prophet who was divinely honored. He was a performer of miracles. He's one of the two people besides Jesus to raise somebody, or three people besides Jesus to raise somebody from the dead. Two people in the Old Testament who raised somebody from the dead. Elisha being the other one later on. A God-inspired prophet ready to obey and trust God, like Joe just referenced. And he was a saint whose end was glorious. And glorious that's one word for it, which we'll see. But I thought it was a good little skeletal type outline laid out in the handout that you can study him in 1 Kings with these prepositions, he says. So, first of all, we see him before Ahab. So he got to go before Ahab. Ahab, good or bad? What kind of king was he? He was pretty bad. Maybe not as bad as his wife, but that ain't saying much. So he had to minister before Ahab. And we already know how Ahab feels about bad news. It was Ahab that said, I don't want to get Micaiah in here because I hate that guy. He never tells me anything good. Well, Elijah had some hard things to tell Ahab too. One of them is the first thing that we read about him. He's saying, it's not going to rain until I tell it to rain. And that lasted quite a while. 3.5 years? Not the best of news, but we read about him before Ahab. Then we immediately read about him going towards this brook or river, Kerith, east of the Jordan. God says you're going to drink from the brook, and the ravens are going to feed you. Interesting. Would love to see to have been able to see how that worked. But we can't. We just know that it happened. At Zarephath, and this is the incident that Jesus refers to when he's trying to get into the Pharisees' thick skulls, that it's not all about the Jews. How many widows of Israel did God send Elijah to? 0. But he did send him to a widow of Zarephath outside of Israel. And that's what we read about in the remainder of chapter 17. And that's where he raises the woman's son from the dead. And by the way, it wasn't easy. It seems like it's something very fascinating about the way Jesus raised people from the dead, and even Peter and Paul, that the 2 Old Testament accounts of somebody raising somebody from the dead, it seemed to be extremely difficult by Jesus' standards. Now, I don't know, exactly what that's about, but it is interesting, at least, that, the days of it just, to me, emphasizes even more the days of the Messiah and how much different it was. The power. It's not that God had less power back then, but it's just interesting that Elijah, he had to put forth some effort, it seems, for this to be done. And Elisha, maybe even more effort. Just a little side note that I've always found fascinating. He stretched himself over the child 3 times and was crying out. You don't read, Jesus didn't do anything like that. He just said, get up. And there it is. Here he comes. Here she comes, whatever it is. Time to get up. I can't even be woke from a sleep that easily. So that's something. Dean, do you have something? Yeah. Yeah. The power of God still worked through him. Again, raising somebody from the dead is a miracle in any case. No matter how hard the human instrument had to work for it, still a miracle. But I think that was probably all part of God's intention and plan, that not that it was harder back then, but that when Jesus came, it was totally different. It was unthinkable. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was trying. And that's why I think it's interesting. It says, and Jehovah listened to the voice of Elijah. And then the child came back to life. Also, real quick, interesting note, in that account, twice in the ESV and in verse 21, it says, he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to Jehovah, O Jehovah, my God, let this child's life come into him again. The word translated life there in the Hebrew is also could be translated soul. What's the point? Well, that they're the same thing. The spirit in the body, the spirit is life. That's the life. Just like James said, the body apart from the spirit is dead. The body, which would imply that the body with the spirit is what makes it alive. Well, here it's just interesting how let the child's life come into him again, but also let his soul come into him again. And there's other references like this as well. I think whenever somebody the woman was giving birth, and I don't remember if it was Rebecca or Eli, the situation that we looked at with Eli, but I think it was Rebecca actually. It said her soul departed for she died. So the soul departs means death. The soul there in the body means life. And if life begins at conception, then that means if there's a spirit, there's life. Yep. Okay. So the widow's son, that's the situation. Then in chapter 18, it says, or we read about the infamous showdown on Mount Carmel, which was one of Elijah's big, this was a big event, a big deal. The word of God came to Elijah, told him to go up to Ahab. It's time for it to rain on the earth. And they go, and Jezebel, lovely Jezebel, there were all these prophets that, hundreds of prophets of Baal. And they go up and they're gonna have a showdown on the mountain. And Elijah prevails. Really, God prevails. But it's a fascinating account. Just again demonstrates Elijah's courage, his power. It took a lot of guts, it took a lot of courage, it took a lot of faith, but he did it. And he called them out. They were false prophets. Their God didn't exist. And he kind of challenges them and says, hey, I got an idea. You call upon the name of your God, and I'll call upon the name of Jehovah, and we'll see which God answers, okay? And whichever God answers, he is God. Well, guess what happened? They cried out. They did they were acting. I can't even imagine witnessing what he witnessed. I mean, people acting like animals almost, screaming and cutting themselves and trying as hard as they could. No one answered. But then Elijah, again, talk about Jesus raising people from the dead. It was easy God answered right then. Yeah, it sounds funny to me when he says, where's your God, Maybe he's occupied or something. He's relieving himself. Must be in the bathroom. Must be out on a journey. He's not home. Or he's asleep. Come on, that's funny. It's sarcasm, but it's humorous sarcasm. Yeah, Dean?
Well, it was about 300 of them. I can't remember how the total number of prophets. 300 against one God. If you get 300, then there's only one of Elijah.
Yeah, one versus 450 or whatever?
Yeah, I guess 450.
But you know what? What it really came down to was the God versus imaginary gods. So, but they could have killed him or something. They could have tried. They could have, But he trusted and had faith. And again, his mission, his goal was really to prove in whatever way the circumstances required was to serve God, and when given the opportunity or it presented itself, to prove that God was God. And that's what he did and continued to do. So there he is before on Mount Carmel. And we see him out in the wilderness. Yes, he was brave, but at the same time, he wasn't too big to run, too, sometimes. He ran from Jezebel. Who can blame him, really? I'm not going to fault him for running from Jezebel. I would have, too. And never come back. But he's running from Jezebel. But God's with him the whole time. Goes and hides out in a cave. God's with him. He was a rugged kind of, we get the impression he was kind of a rugged type of prophet. And I think that is a lot of the reason why in the prophecy, John the Baptizer was said to come in the spirit and power of Elijah. It wasn't going to be that Elijah was coming. But and that passage in Luke is the explanation for the misunderstanding of some of the Jews to think that Elijah was actually going to come back. No, Jesus says he already has. It was John. Well, how does that? Malachi didn't say John was coming. He said Elijah was coming. Well, John came in the spirit and power of Elijah. He was a lot like Elijah. He wasn't Elijah reborn or back to the earth. He wasn't Elijah reincarnate. He was like Elijah in so many ways. And our handout points this out too. Their familiarity with the desert and solitude, their austere manner and dress, strong reproof of prevailing evils, their intrepid fidelity in calling all classes to repentance, their exposure of the wrath of a wicked king, their continued influence after death through disciples, and their fruitful labors. They had all these things in common. But I think one of the things that seemed to impress on the minds of James and John the most, as far as Elijah's power, is what happens at the beginning of 2 Kings, which means I skipped a part that I didn't want to skip, the discouragement part. Elijah was not immune to discouragement. Even a man who was a prophet called by God, who was given power by God, even he was discouraged at times, and he cried to God and said, "I've been very jealous for Jehovah, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant." This is chapter 19, verse 14. "Forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away." And God answered him and just said, "Listen, I need you to go to Damascus. When you get there, I need you to anoint Hazael to be king over Syria." That alone is interesting in itself. Why is a prophet of God from Israel going to Syria to anoint a king? But anyway, Jehu, the son of Nimshi, to anoint as king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat, you shall anoint to be your replacement. Right when he cried out about being alone, he also reminded him, you're not as alone as you think you are. There are still people in this land who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So he informed him, you're not alone, literally. You may be lonely, but you're not totally alone. The prophets may have all been killed, but you're not totally alone. At the very least, which is a terrible understatement, I guess, he was still with him. So, but he could have just said, "Elijah, what do you mean you're alone? I'm right here." But he didn't just say that. He said, "I've got somebody that I need you to go and anoint." And as he anointed him as his replacement, he would eventually, it seems, if not immediately, become his sidekick to sort of train up a little bit to take his place. So he's not alone anymore. Even though he felt it, God provided. Dean, do you have something? Okay. So that's what we read in the rest of chapter 19 as he goes and gets Elisha. And it says, then he arose and went after Elijah and assisted him. So it does seem that it was fairly immediate that Elisha went with him. Then in chapter 20 and 21 and 22, well, not all of 21, but chapter half of 21, in the middle there at least, Elijah is given a task to do. But then chapter 22 is when Ahab ends up dying, getting killed. And then in 2 Kings is where Elijah is hiding out again, it seems, and these men are coming out to get him from the king, and he strikes them down with fire from heaven twice. The third group was smarter, but this is what John and James were referring to when they said in Samaria, "Do you want us to call down fire from heaven and burn this village to the ground like Elijah?" This is what they're talking about. Elijah did this, and that seemed to stick in their minds as much as anything else. Maybe not the best thing to remember him by, If I was him, I would think, I did a lot of good things. Maybe you shouldn't just dwell on that one, but it still was evidence of his power. I mean, we don't read of any other prophets doing that. Do you have some great question to ask? I did two whos. Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I did that just for you. He's been trying to get my attention for 15 minutes, 25 minutes. Just in case you missed it, the man who, okay? Thank you, Roman. That's not the only time that happened, but I caught the other one and I fixed it. So I had two words back to back but I didn't notice the most obvious one. Okay, so after that, shortly after that is when Elijah, God, and I think it's significant. It doesn't seem to be too long after he was crying out and clearly getting weary and exhausted in his ministry, that God not only, he immediately picked his replacement, told him to go anoint him. He started to serve him and get trained up. And it doesn't seem that too much time passed before God was letting him be done. And here he goes. He's not even going to make him have to die. Even Moses had to die. But Elijah, he just gets to go. Just like that. I mean, it's almost like, I'll let you come early. Won't wait for you to die of some cause of being killed or old age or whatever. Just come on up. Come now. And Elisha got to see that, and that's not something that you see and ever forget. And he probably didn't. Elisha's ministry, not to get ahead of ourselves, but it was quite a bit different than Elijah's. And I think Elisha, I don't like to pick favorites, but it's the thing about Elisha's ministry compared to Elijah's is it's so lowly. He was with the people. He was with the folks. We see people in Elisha's life and ministry that we don't even ever read about in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament, we're reading about kings and nations and armies and battles and the temple and, priests and all these things. What about the normal people? What about the regular people? Well, when we get to Elisha's ministry, which we'll see, I think we're going to look at some. Actually, I may have forgotten about Elijah and went ahead and got ahead of myself. So I think it said Elizabeth and Esther. Actually, Elizabeth would be, but I'm thinking out loud here, trying to figure out the alphabet on the spot. Elizabeth would be for Elisha, but we'll try to figure that out. Elisha will take a little bit more time, I think. So we'll look at his ministry and see, just regular old people like us with that had what we would call just little problems. It's not big. It's not going to rain for 3.5 years until I tell it to rain, or let's go up to Mount Carmel and have a showdown between me and 450 prophets of Baal, or anything, calling fire from heaven to strike down these 50 soldiers. It's like somebody drops an axe head in the river. Literally, I didn't make that up. You remember that story? He borrowed an axe and the axe head flew off, and he's distraught. Like he's all torn up about it. Little things like that. What's a big deal? And all of the things we read about in his ministry, they're all little things about little people, and yet God cares even about those little things. Yeah, Dean.
I know that Elisha, he requested from God one thing. I can't remember exactly what he requested from God that he give him. And I think it was Elijah's smoke from a double portion. Yeah, double portion. Do you remember that?
Whenever he's about to leave, he drops his cloak down. Or he says, ask me what you would have of me, because I'm about to leave, and he says a double portion of your spirit or whatever. And I think, if I remember right, Elijah kind of says no. I think he says that's not something I can do. I may be forgetting, misremembering, but yeah. But he goes back across the river and sees that cloak there, and he takes it, and he is officially the new Elijah. And kind of wish that he had a name that was a little bit more different than Elijah, so I don't get them mixed up all the time in certain details. But as a rule, like I said, Elisha's ministry is, if it's something lowly and something just normal and down to earth and just a simple little thing, other than raising somebody from the dead, it was Elisha. Not that Elisha didn't do any big things, but we don't read any little, household type things, other than going to the widow of Zarephath. But that was even that was a big deal with the famine and the jar and all that, the meal or whatever. So, lessons from Elijah. Here's just a few. We should pray for the boldness to proclaim the truth of God's word. That's what Elijah did. He had the boldness. He had to. God picked his prophets well. He knew the people would do it. The fear of God, and by the way, Acts 4:29, when Peter and John prayed they were getting arrested, but we pray, give us the boldness to keep preaching. And Ephesians 6, Paul says, pray for me that I may continue to have the boldness to keep preaching. Not pray for my safety, just give me the strength to keep preaching, even in a lack of safety. So we should pray for boldness to proclaim the truth, because it's not comfortable all the time. It's not always comfortable, and I would say in maybe most of the time it's not necessarily comfortable. Number 2, the fear of God should outweigh the fear of man. That is a lesson we've seen on several of these characters already. Elijah was afraid of Jezebel, rightly so. He was not immune to fear, but he feared God more. He didn't let that fear drive him away from God and what God wanted him to do. Number 3, even when we feel utterly alone, we should remember that we're not. We're not alone. God provides. We have brothers and sisters. We're not alone. But at the same time, we should make sure that our brothers and sisters know that they're not alone and that we're here. Number 4, God can put people into our lives to aid us in our spiritual journey. I think that's one of the things that God was doing with Elisha. It wasn't just, okay, well, if I'm going to take Elijah out of the earth, somebody's got to take his place. But he didn't have to get Elisha and Elijah together to make that happen. He could have done everything that Elijah did for Elisha himself, but he didn't. He got Elisha in his life. And that reminds me of, David and Jonathan. I don't think there's any doubt that God brought those two men together. And I think David thought that too. And Jonathan probably did too, because of how much Jonathan did for David in his life and what his life would have been like if Jonathan wasn't in his life. God gave Elijah Elisha. At his time of greatest loneliness or lonesomeness, he provided. Also, I was going to include it, but then I realized that I was thinking of something in Elisha's ministry, and then after that I realized that it does apply to Elijah as well. Even with great, I don't even remember how I worded it, but it takes sometimes a lot of power to do, a lot of energy, I should say, to do something for God or of God even. And the reference was to Elijah raising that son from the dead. So even though it was easy for God, Elijah had to pour a lot of exert a lot of his own energy and resources, I guess, in a way, into that. But he was willing to do that because he did it for that woman. God didn't tell him to raise that son from the dead. He did it out of the goodness of his own heart. Mm-hmm.
But just like Abraham, Elijah knew that God would come and take down Baal, and it was a humorous thing with the moat and the whole routine. But Elisha had, I don't know if it was youth or maybe the lack of that knowledge, that Elijah doesn't say the angels had wings when they came down, but there were chariots of fire that separated Elisha from Elijah when he was leaving this earth. And Elisha was able to see that.
Mhm.
The power that God had in the lives of people. And he was sitting there like, wow, what did I just see?
Yeah.
And he didn't see any more, it was like a whirlwind. But it sounds like a lot of them. It wasn't just a dead angel coming down and tapping on the shoulder saying, time to go.
Yeah.
Really was received in heaven.
Yep. Chariots of fire and horses. In fact, I don't even think it says anything about angels at all. It just says
Well, that's,
chariots of fire and horses.
the messengers came to get him.
Where's it? Where's that?
When he says the myriads of, I'm sure it says, well, I lost it. But the picture.
I'm sure it says it, yeah.
A chariot is not gonna go without somebody driving it.
Well, God can drive it. Here she is arguing about the nature of chariots of fire and how they have to have a driver. Chariots of fire coming from heaven and going back to heaven have to have somebody driving it. I'm not so sure it does have to have somebody driving it.
There, thank you.
Where is it? Oh, and it's horsemen in verse 12, okay. So verse 11 just says chariots of fire and horses, but
Which is messengers for the horsemen.
it's horsemen, yeah. Just telling you what Elisha said, anyway. It doesn't say messengers, it says horsemen, but anyway. Last week I didn't talk about horsemen, okay? I talked about angels and messengers, but it says horsemen. But they were, do we want to talk about whether they were on fire too?
No,
Okay. Good.
I have a picture in my head and I don't want you to bring it.
Or if they were on fire or made of fire. It says they were of fire, so I don't know if that means they were made of fire or if they were on fire.
Or just that they were going very fast.
Okay.
That'd be impressive.
Yes, it was impressive. Thank you.
Would it be the same ones that Elisha asked God to open his servant's eyes so he could see? Would it be the same, like,
It's just
Same image, I guess. In that case, angels are specifically mentioned, but because they were about to fight. They were fighting the battle. So in this case, Elijah is getting to leave and finally let go of his burden, which probably should be the last lesson, that those who are faithful to God will get their relief. And even if it doesn't come as early as we would like, it does come. But faithfulness is the key, because there's another kind of fire that would await otherwise.